Why don't you go wait over there like everyone else? The sharp voice sliced through the air as the woman stepped toward the desk. No greeting, no eye contact, no respect. Two uniformed officers barely glanced up from their paperwork, responding to her quiet inquiry with annoyance. One of them lifted a brow and scanned her from head to toe, then smirked beneath his buzz cut. His partner didn't say a word, just sipped coffee and rolled his eyes. She stood motionless, holding onto her tote bag and silence like armor. She was tall with espresso-brown skin and deep black curls pulled into a low bun. Her sneakers were worn in, her gray cardigan soft and casual. She didn't look like authority, not the kind they were used to. She didn't speak like she needed to prove anything, and that made them uncomfortable. The police station lobby was busy but not overwhelmed. People waiting on hard plastic chairs, fluorescent lights humming above, the smell of cheap floor cleaner lingering in the halls. She'd come through the scanner without issue, greeted the security guard politely, and approached the information desk with a simple question. Could I speak with someone regarding the community outreach program? The answer had been laughter, then condescension, then silence. She gave a small nod and stepped aside, her calm making the officers noticeably irritated. But she didn't flinch, didn't argue. Instead, she sat down in the corner of the room, between a flickering vending machine and a peeling poster claiming, "We're here to serve." To everyone else, she looked like a tired woman with time on her hands and not much power in her voice. But she had more authority in her stillness than most people had in their shouting. Nobody there knew her name that day. Nobody knew she'd spent 17 years studying law enforcement operations from coast to coast. Nobody guessed she held 2 advanced degrees, had written books on institutional ethics, or sat weekly in strategic meetings advising departments 10 times the size of this one. Today wasn't about titles. It was about truth. The police station had recently announced bold plans for reform. New leadership was on the way. Local news had buzzed about a historic appointment, the first black woman to ever serve as regional director of police strategy. Very few people had seen her photo. She'd requested it that way. She believed you could learn a lot by watching unfiltered behavior. How a team acted when they didn't know they were being watched was more honest than any official report. That's what she'd come to see. Unfiltered behavior. The front desk, arguably the first line of community interaction, was a mess of assumptions. A young white man in khakis approached and was instantly offered help. The older Latino woman with a cane was interrupted repeatedly. A middle-aged black father tried to update his statement on a domestic harassment case and got lectured about wasting resources. She watched it all, noted every word, every body movement. Her eyes were sharp, but her face never revealed what she was thinking. The officer who first dismissed her, the one with the buzz cut, occasionally glanced her way. Each time, his expression grew more agitated, as if her very presence was a challenge. After about 30 minutes, he muttered something under his breath to his partner, who laughed but didn't look up. In the corner of the lobby, she sent a quick message on her phone. Not a complaint, not a warning, just a reminder message to her assistant. Observing front-end engagement today. Arrive unseen. Leave noise for later. She didn't need applause. She didn't want titles spoken in advance. She wanted to see what people did when no one was watching because that was the version she was going to build from, or tear down. A child started crying across the room. The desk officers frowned, gestured impatiently at a young mother struggling to soothe her toddler. Their annoyance was amplified, not concealed. Still, the woman in the gray cardigan said nothing. She watched, she listened, and she waited. She had arrived early with the intention of walking through the space quietly, connecting with the few staffers who'd be working a Saturday shift. She didn't need anyone to roll out a welcome banner. She just wanted to meet the people she would soon be leading and protecting from themselves. She had once believed that changing systems meant changing rules. Now she understood it required something deeper, changing habits, attitudes, the small, casual cruelties that too often built up in rooms like this one. 45 minutes after her arrival, the same officer, his badge read Sims, appeared visibly impatient, as though her not leaving counted as resisting the natural order. He finally walked toward her, voice noticeably louder than needed, and asked if she understood she wasn't allowed to lurk in the waiting area. Her only reply was a slow smile. "No problem. I'll leave when I've seen what I've come to see," she said softly. Perhaps her patience made them angrier than defiance ever could. Sims walked away muttering again, and it was clear he was no longer ignoring her. He was trying to figure her out, but he couldn't place her. She didn't play the role he'd assigned her in his mind. All the while, the woman remained calm, not afraid. There was no hate in her eyes, only endurance, grace sharpened by years of being underestimated. She was here to lead them, but first she was here to listen. What she'd witnessed in this single hour would be more valuable to her than 3 months' worth of scheduled meetings. This wasn't the story they would tell in Monday's press release. But what she'd witnessed today, was the real story. The kind that doesn't make headlines until it's too loud to ignore. The quiet tension that had begun when she first entered the station didn't ease. It deepened. What began as passive indifference was now turning into something sharper. The two officers behind the desk began making louder remarks to each other. Little jabs, barely hidden, but clearly not meant to be private. Laughter followed, short and cruel. Every snide comment sounded exaggerated, meant to be overheard by the woman still sitting in the lobby corner. She said nothing. Her hands were calm in her lap. Time passed slowly. More people came through the doors. A teenager with bruises on his face. A woman protecting her shaking hands. A man asking hesitantly for help retrieving his car. Most of them were treated the same way. Cold voices, instructions without empathy, long silences of being ignored between sentences. She watched it all carefully, quietly. She had read about microaggressions and professional discourtesy before. But this wasn't something you could describe in a report. This was something you had to feel to understand. It was in how they looked past people. How they tightened their jaws when someone spoke too slowly or asked a follow-up question. The judgment in their eyes wasn't hidden. And yet people still hoped for help as they stood before the desk, trying their best to stay polite, even when they were met with contempt. When the woman in the cardigan finally stood again, nearly an hour after being asked to wait, the desk sergeant let out an exaggerated sigh. He didn't ask what she needed. He didn't apologize for the wait. Instead, he made it clear he hadn't forgotten her, and wasn't happy she was still there. He pointed toward an empty seat without a word, but his look said it all. "Go sit down. You're not welcome at this desk." Her voice remained steady. She mentioned that she had called ahead earlier in the week to speak with someone from outreach, and that she believed the staff had access to her name. This was too much for the other officer, Bradley, younger but just as dismissive. He straightened up, put down his pen, and gave a smirk as he leaned forward. That look carried all the weight of someone who felt power not through service, but superiority. Though she hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made any demands, Officer Bradley treated her as a nuisance. Loud enough for others to hear, he made a remark about how some people think they're more important than they are. Nothing in his tone could be called professional. Some people in the lobby had begun watching more carefully now. The older man next to her shifted in his seat. A mother with a child resting against her noticed the officer's tone and raised her eyebrows, silently mouthing to someone next to her. Other staff moved in and out of the hallway connecting to the back offices, but none stepped in. The woman took a breath and asked, calmly, to speak with the day's supervisor. Her request was met with mocking disbelief. Officer Sims laughed under his breath, shaking his head, muttering something about entitlement. Then, his voice lifted, laced with challenge. He said the supervisor was too busy dealing with real issues, and maybe she should file a complaint online if she was that bothered. A few people in the waiting area turned to look. Her calm was making them nervous, because calm, in the face of disrespect, is often more powerful than shouting. And more dangerous. She asked once again respectfully for a contact. A phone number. An email for community affairs. Something. Bradley leaned forward and said something low about attitude. Sims grunted in agreement, and once again turned away from her, acting as though she wasn't speaking at all. At no point had she shown anger, but somehow her still presence became a threat. They couldn't figure out why her gaze remained steady, why she didn't storm out or escalate like they expected. She wasn't playing her part in the story they were used to. It bothered them. As time moved on, a quiet murmuring had started among the other people sitting nearby. One woman took out her phone and began to record. She didn't say much, just tapped the screen and quietly zoomed in on the officers. Another man leaned toward his partner and whispered. She didn't even raise her voice, and they're acting like she cursed them out. Something was shifting. The woman, for her part, wasn't trying to make a scene. She simply stepped slightly to the side to allow an elderly veteran to speak to the desk about a missing identification card. The officers were warm and cheerful with him, laughing, even offering water while they helped him fill out a form. The woman noticed the change in their tone. They hadn't spoken like that to anyone else all day. Only now. Only after realizing some people still deserved their approval. Some people still fit their easy idea of worthy visitors. The woman sat back down, eyes focused on her notes app. She typed with slow care. She wasn't documenting what was said, but how it was said. How easy it had been for these men, sworn to serve their community, to decide who deserved dignity and who did not. Officer Bradley glanced over again. By now he was restless, uncertain. Something about her presence was starting to bother him on a deeper level. He didn't understand this woman who didn't respond to their commands with fear or frustration. Someone who didn't leave, didn't yell, just waited and documented and observed. Their power meant very little when it wasn't being received with fear. He said something sharp again. This time a louder comment about people thinking they're better than the rules. A young black man, seated one row behind her, spoke up gently, said she'd been calm the whole time, that it seemed unfair. Bradley turned to him and told him to stay out of it. The young man sat back, clearly frustrated, but unwilling to take it further. The tension had become real now, not just discomfort but unease. Not just for those seated in the lobby, but for the staff who had unknowingly spent the afternoon talking down to the incoming head of their own department. And still, she said almost nothing. But the difference was clear. The room was watching her now. And something told them. This stranger was not what she seemed. By the time the noon sun cast long streaks of light through the high windows of the police station lobby, the woman in the gray cardigan had become more than just another face waiting to be helped. She had become the silent center of something growing. Something angry, something unsettled. She hadn't moved for close to 2 hours. While the desk officers joked, dismissed, and postured, she stayed anchored to her little corner. Calm, still, watching. The insults hadn't shaken her. The long wait hadn't broken her. And that was confusing for them. To the casual observer, perhaps she looked out of place, maybe even lost. But there was a quiet certainty in the way she sat, legs neatly crossed, eyes taking everything in like a deep lake that never ripples. Her name, unknown to everyone else in the room, was Kamira Rhodes. And Kamira was not the kind of person who rushed to expose a problem. She let it reveal itself. Around her, the energy in the lobby began to shift. Subtle at first. A few side eyes, passing glances, longer stares. People were beginning to notice the obvious contrast in how the officers treated different visitors. A young white woman approached to ask about a missing persons report and received warmth, soft direction, and smiles. 30 seconds after she left, a young Latino man stepped forward and simply asked about his brother, who had been detained the night before. The officers flat out ignored him. Kamira noticed the woman seated closest to the door. A middle-aged lady holding her toddler on her lap was now watching very closely. The mother's eyes kept darting between Kamira and the desk, processing the pattern. Meanwhile, across the room, a college-aged man quietly positioned his phone to point toward the front. He had started recording quietly and without commentary, capturing the treatment he and others were witnessing in real time. They weren't activists, not protesters, just regular people picking up on something that no longer felt hidden. It was in the air, this unspoken question. Why her? Why was this one black woman treated with such audible disrespect? Why was she the only one constantly being dismissed, ignored, charged with imaginary offenses like waiting too long? The tension didn't scream. It simmered. Kamira continued to take small notes on her phone. She didn't make any calls, didn't attempt to raise her voice, but her still presence remained louder than any outburst. That was the thing. She never fed the drama, never gave them a moment to accuse her of being out of line. She just existed, and somehow her dignity was unbearable to those who tried to belittle her. She noticed others were starting to shift in their seats. Some leaned forward a bit, as if subconsciously readying themselves for somebody to speak out. Others adjusted their bags and phones, filming quietly, sharing glances that spoke volumes. The stab of injustice often starts as a tightening in the chest. But in a room full of people from all backgrounds, seeing the same cruelty in the open was becoming impossible to ignore. A small moment sealed it. A woman walked in, tall, blonde, wearing a name-brand coat and heels. The same Officer Sims who had told Kamira to stop loitering snapped upright. He greeted the new visitor with warmth, even offered assistance before she opened her mouth. Kamira didn't even look up this time, but others did. The change in behavior was undeniable. The older woman near the vending machine turned slightly to look at Kamira, then back at the desk, expression caught between pity and fury. A young black father whispered something to his teenage son, who furrowed his brows and pulled out his phone without being asked. The quiet had transformed from observation into witnessing. It only took one voice to shift the balance. A boy, maybe 16, leaned over toward his sister beside him and whispered, not softly enough, "They've been acting like she committed a crime just for walking in." He wasn't trying to incite anything. It was just an honest observation. But once spoken, the truth didn't stay small. A few people nodded. Others murmured softly, piecing things together. This wasn't isolated. This was a way of interaction, deeply learned and repeated. Officer Bradley glanced up and caught the murmuring. His mood soured as he adjusted his shoulders like someone aware of being watched. But still, his posture screamed resentment, as if he were the one being wronged, not the one who had stomped on another's dignity again and again. And still, Kamira said nothing. Her stillness now felt deliberate. Her patience, her quiet, had grown larger than the two men behind the desk. Their smirks had faded. Their jokes died out completely. They were beginning to feel the weight of the room turning. A few moments later, a different officer, one who had not been present earlier, came through a side hallway. He had a clipboard in hand and a look of routine, but when his eyes landed on Kamira, he slowed. Recognition flickered across his face. Not full awareness yet, but something about her seemed familiar. He paused to speak to a colleague in a hushed voice, occasionally glancing back toward the woman in the cardigan. That brief exchange sent a ripple through the energy near the desk. It was small but clear, the first moment that suggested things might not be as they appeared. Kamira remained still through it all. A little girl, no older than 8, walked by holding her mother's hand. As they passed Kamira's seat, the child looked up and whispered to her mom, "Why's everyone looking at that lady?" The mother gave a quiet answer Kamira couldn't hear, but she smiled gently anyway. The innocence in the question cut deeper than any accusation. Sometimes a moment doesn't explode, it unfolds. By now, 2 more people had visibly joined those quietly filming. Social media began to light up, not through influencers or protests, but through everyday citizens who felt something sacred had been stepped on right in front of them. Kamira didn't need signs or chance. She had visible truth. And truth, when captured, has a power no badge can silence. Her silence was not weakness. It was a storm gathering focus. One breath at a time. One witness at a time. And soon it would reach the ones who thought she had no voice. The air had changed inside that police station lobby, though most wouldn't be able to say exactly when. Kamira Rhodes was still seated, still quiet, still waiting. But now others were waiting too, not to be helped at the desk, but to see what would happen next. Her calm had spread like roots through the room. She had planted herself without needing to raise a hand. Yet the attention she drew carried weight now, not curiosity. The line between silence and power had blurred. The officers behind the desk were no longer in control of the room. Not really. What was once a routine Saturday shift had become a stage they weren't prepared for. And they started to feel it in the heavy glances, the cameras angled toward them, the slowing of their own voices as they realized nobody was laughing anymore. Still, Kamira had not raised her voice. She didn't shout. She didn't demand. Instead, she reached into her tote bag quietly and pulled out a small, black leather planner. Not flashy, not large, but intentional. In it was a sleek silver nameplate clipped to a card. People watching didn't know what she'd just pulled out, but something inside her movements made it clear. This wasn't random. She reached into her inside pocket and pulled out a small pin, about the size of a coin. She examined it, then pinned it to her lapel. It gleamed softly in the fluorescent light. Blue, gold, and silver, the insignia of the Department of Civilian Oversight. She didn't wear it for attention. She wore it for what would come next. Something else shifted then, like the slow crack in ice before a break. A man seated nearby, he hadn't spoken before, leaned gently toward her, close enough for only her to hear, and quietly asked if she needed backup. She smiled, just barely. Not amused. Grateful. Her head tilted slightly in thanks, and he sat back, satisfied with the non-answer. More people were watching now. Perhaps half the room understood something bigger was happening. The buzz-cut officer, Sims, began to glance her way with increasing suspicion. That nameplate, that pin, what was she doing? He clearly wanted to ask, but couldn't find the right tone. Couldn't be pleasant now without uncovering his own sudden cowardice. Kamira stood up. After more than 2 hours, her legs stretched, but her posture was still poised. She wasn't angry. No, anger would have been expected, dismissed even. What she carried was something far stronger. Presence. She walked over to the front counter. Slowly, as if controlling not just pace but pressure in the room. Every step was deliberate. The younger officer, Bradley, stiffened. His fingers tapped against the desk. His forced calm face was crumbling around the edges. He'd made this woman the target of jokes, irritation, and downright unkindness. Not imagining for a moment someone like her could actually be in a position that mattered. Someone like her. Kamira placed a small card on the counter. No words, just emotion so fluid and natural it made the air feel thinner. Sims picked it up and let his eyes fall to the print. Silence. His posture changed instantly. It wasn't subtle. His jaw flexed as he tried to decide whether to speak, whether to accept what he'd just read. He handed the card to Bradley, whose smug confidence drained like water from a cracked bucket. Kamira remained still. The card now sat between them. Kamira Rhodes, Director, Office of Police Oversight and Community Integrity Executive Appointee. Regional Police Reform Initiative. There was no mistaking the title. No pretending she was someone else. She was the person they'd been warned about in Monday's department-wide memo. The person they'd been told would be visiting stations soon, as part of a low-profile evaluation. Low profile, indeed. Now it made sense, the calm, the note-taking, the patience. It hadn't been nervous waiting. It was observation, inspection. The room caught on quick. One woman across the aisle pressed a hand to her mouth. The teen with the phone muttered, "Yo," softly to himself and zoomed in. A father whispered to his daughter, and she nodded wide-eyed. Even those who didn't fully understand who she was knew enough to recognize what was happening. The power had shifted. Kamira, still not raising her voice, simply asked if the supervisor was now available for 10 minutes of his time. This time, nothing was dismissed. No jokes. The officers could barely find words. Sims picked up the phone, voice tight, and asked for Captain Monroe to come to the lobby. There was no false casualness in his tone, just urgency. Kamira returned to her seat. When the doors opened a few minutes later and Captain Monroe appeared in uniform, his eyes scanned the lobby and instantly found her. You could see recognition hit him like a cold wind. He hurried across the room, reaching out to shake her hand with both of his, already apologizing with his eyes even before his mouth could form the words. Onlookers were fully engaged now and cameras stayed on. No one moved. You could feel heartbeats. You could feel shame swallowing uniformed pride. Monroe bent close to speak privately, but Kamira remained in posture, straight and purposeful. This was no longer just a private meeting. It was now something public, necessary. As they spoke, Monroe's head dipped lower. His body language turned remorseful. The desk officers avoided eye contact as civilians recorded every moment. This wasn't just a bad shift anymore. It was a reality check, one they couldn't outrun. The woman they had belittled had just become their lesson. Kamira didn't boast. She didn't shame them with her status. She didn't throw names or issue orders. She didn't need to. The truth they thought they could hide had arrived early, and it was wearing a modest cardigan and calm eyes. And now, the systems behind them, their bosses, their board, and soon the mayor, would hear about how these officers treated members of the public. Not in reports, not through hearsay, but from the woman hired to fix it. Slowly, systemically, and starting with them, Captain Monroe stood in front of her, eyes wide with a mixture of guilt and dread, as though he were trying to shrink his entire presence down to something less than him. But it was too late for that now. What had just unfolded in that lobby could not be undone. Not by title, not by begging, and definitely not by looking afraid. Kamira did not power forward. She didn't lean on the embarrassment of others or speak as if she had power. She didn't need to. Her presence had already taken up the space that truth required. Everyone watching knew. Whether they understood the hierarchy or not, they felt it in their bones. This woman, who had been treated with such lightness and suspicion, was a force far beyond the two men behind the desk. Her silence had stretched long enough, and now it wrapped them all in something undeniable. Word spread quickly inside the station. From the moment the supervisor offered his full apology, staff in the hallways and offices began emerging to try and glimpse her. Whispers flew. That's her. She was out here this whole time? Nobody realized? Of course, no one realized. Because they hadn't looked closely. Because they hadn't listened. Because she didn't look important. That truth hit harder than any speech ever could. It was written across the faces of the officers now filing out from back rooms to make sense of what they'd missed. Kamira hadn't been hiding. She had simply existed, and they had overlooked her, underestimated her, and disrespected her every step of the way. This was the twist the moment called for. Not a reveal that blew open with raised voices and scolding words, but something deeper and quieter. A reckoning dressed in calm. Officer Sims hadn't spoken since reading the card. His hands stayed clasped below the counter, shoulders pulled tight, like someone preparing for punishment yet still unsure what form it would take. Officer Bradley's smug grin was gone, replaced by the vacant stare of a man realizing the internet had already swallowed his career whole. By now, the young man who'd started filming had already uploaded the footage, 5 short minutes of clips layered with text across the screen. She was calm from the beginning. They treated her like a complaint, not a visitor. Plot twist. She's their new boss. It was already circulating, gaining views by the second. People online didn't just watch stories like this. They reshaped them. They gave them wings. Captain Monroe's apology continued, but Kamira remained planted, looking over the officers who had offered her nothing but shame a few hours ago. She let the silence work. She allowed their discomfort to fill the space the way hers had been overshadowed when she was forced to wait by that cold vending machine. Now they waited. Now they witnessed. Monroe finally asked if she would allow him to escort her upstairs for a meeting, offering to clear a room or call the district chief. Kamira didn't answer right away. She collected her planner, tucked the business card back into its slot, then gently turned to the young man whose quiet support earlier had gone unnoticed by many. Without words, she made clear that what truly mattered here wasn't her position. It was who had seen her when nobody else did. And slowly she walked past the desk, past the officers, past their forced stillness. Camera lenses followed as she moved through the secure door Monroe opened, disappearing into the hallway she had earned long before today. In rooms where fluorescent light fell on metal nameplates and dry erase boards marked with strategy diagrams, Kamira sat calmly beside the captain and opened her worn folder. In it were the names of every officer on weekend lobby shifts. She had written observations handwritten in the margins, about tone of voice, body language, time spent with each visitor. The facts were undeniable. The video footage circulating online was already pulling in comments from former visitors of the station. Others had stories. That officer once brushed off my report. I was told to file online when I was crying in person. She sat there, and they treated her like nothing. The station's Twitter account was tagging responses faster than usual. The mayor's office had issued a bland statement about awareness and accountability, but the public wanted more than talk. By mid-afternoon, the department's chief of communications had called Kamira directly to say she had their support. "Just tell us what you need to move this forward," they said. But she didn't need help. This wasn't a crisis to contain. This was the breakthrough she'd waited for. Days of training and weeks of memos hadn't exposed the frontline rot. Her quiet, single visit had revealed the truth. Systems don't change by suggestion. They crack open through confrontation, even when that confrontation comes in silence. Back in the lobby, the officers were instructed to write reports explaining their actions. Human resources arrived later. By then, the online video had been picked up by a local evening news station. The story was framed the way people understood pain best, in personal terms. A quiet visitor turned out to be a quiet leader. And today, a city listened. A young intern in the Office of Community Affairs printed every comment from the original video post. By the end of the day, over 3,000 people had typed sentences beginning with, "This reminds me of when," or, "I felt the same way walking into places where I wasn't seen." That was the real story, not Kamira's resume or her title or the surprise of the officers when they realized who she was. It was about the community realizing how often their dignity had been traded for assumptions, and how, sometimes, justice wears a gray cardigan and refuses to fold. That evening, Kamira went home without cameras outside her house, without press in the driveway. She wasn't interested in spotlight, never had been. She wrote a short note in her journal. "Truth isn't loud, but it lingers. Tomorrow I begin again. But today we cracked something open." In the morning, institutional cleanup would begin. Apologies would be written. Retraining sessions scheduled. But the real reform had already started. It began the moment someone with quiet power walked into a room, was seen as less, and stayed. Not to prove herself, but to let everyone else prove who they truly were. The days that followed were heavier than expected. What began as a quiet visit meant for observation had roared into the public eye, and nothing about the station, or the people inside it, would remain untouched. Kamira Rhodes didn't ask for headlines. She didn't need viral videos or trending hashtags. But in the age of handheld witnesses, truth lives everywhere now. On screens, in text overlays, in comment sections filled with stories from people who never had the courage or opportunity to speak out before. The video of her treatment in the station had traveled far. It wasn't just about disrespect anymore. It had become proof of an ugliness people had tried to name for years, but struggled to show. Here it was, clear on digital film. A black woman, professional and composed, was disrespected, ignored, and mocked, only to later be revealed as the very person hired to oversee reform. And the world noticed. News outlets ran the story with titles that echoed public sentiment. Dismissed, then revealed. The commissioner at the counter. Proof and power in plain sight. Major networks replayed the now famous lobby clip where Officer Sims had spoken down to Kamira minutes before realizing who she was. Her dignity became the defining image of what it meant to challenge a broken culture without saying much at all. Internally, the police station was in crisis mode. Emergency meetings were held behind glass walls, where superiors spoke in tight voices about containment and optics. But what they were truly facing was accountability. And for the first time in a long time, it couldn't be avoided with vague apologies or a quick blame shift. Human resources swept in. Oversight boards requested detailed reports. The independent civilian review panel launched an immediate investigation. Not of Kamira, not of the incident alone, but of the culture that birthed it. Kamira sat with impact. Her days suddenly filled with interviews, formal reviews, email trails, all pointing to not one day of mistreatment, but a pattern. A well-worn routine of officers deciding who mattered from behind glass and marble, and who didn't. Officer Sims and Officer Bradley were placed on administrative leave. What was once considered standard protocol was now clearly called what it was: unprofessional, discriminatory, and dehumanizing. The officers had their union lawyers. They had excuses ready: stress, long shifts, poor training. But none of it could erase the footage or the fact that they had misused their power in front of people who could no longer unsee it. What shook the force even more than the consequences was who delivered them. Kamira didn't return to the station with more security or cameras. She didn't return with a pointed finger or dramatic speech. She simply re-entered through the same front door with the same steady posture and got to work. She called for private follow-up meetings, not just with department heads, but with janitors, front desk staff, retired officers, community volunteers. She wanted to understand the system from every angle. How did this happen? Not in that one moment, but over years. She needed the root, not just the visible rot. Staff members who had once dared to treat her like a stranger now scrambled to answer her questions in full. The tone had changed. Not out of fear, but something else. Embarrassment, reverence, transformation. Her leadership wasn't loud. It was thorough, intentional. She reviewed training materials line by line. She sat with citizen complaints, including those that had been brushed aside due to lack of evidence. Her presence in those rooms reminded people, nothing about justice is one size fits all. Power isn't real if it only shows up for some. Meanwhile, the city watched with sharp attention. Community leaders who had previously given up on police accountability now felt the slightest pull of trust returning. They weren't asking for perfection. They wanted acknowledgement, transparency, and change that didn't just live in written statements but real, uncomfortable action. Under Kamira's recommendation, the City Council launched a full audit of frontline police interactions. They created a rotation program so no officer sat behind the same podium unchecked for years. The front desk, once a cold checkpoint of dismissal, would now be monitored by rotating sergeants, trained in mental health response and community engagement. When word spread that Kamira insisted on monthly mystery assessments, where officers wouldn't know if a visitor was just a citizen or reviewing behavior, there were mixed responses. Some scoffed, others straightened up, but walls began to thin. Pretending systems worked no longer protected anyone. As Sims and Bradley's records were reviewed, a deeper picture emerged. Prior complaints, informal warnings, and signed notes in employee files noting communication concerns. Had they really gone unnoticed, or had they simply gone unchallenged? Kamira's approach was firm but clear. She didn't hunt people. She didn't try to drag reputations through mud. But she held every person responsible for their role in action or silence. And silence, she reminded staff in the first departmental address, had never protected anyone from harm. It only makes it easier to repeat. The effects spread fast. Across town, other departments began reviewing their station procedures. Training officers requested copies of Kamira's audit framework. Larger cities called to ask for consults. What had started as a quiet insult had become a watershed moment across the region. One moment, one woman, one truth caught on tape. But most important, one system finally being asked to admit what it had long denied. That injustice wasn't always a firestorm. Sometimes it was a chair in the corner where the wrong person sat too long without being seen. Kamira knew not to mistake consequence for change. She knew fired officers didn't mean reformed culture. Reform was deeper, harder, slower. Just days after the incident, she hosted a conversation, not with badges or officials, but with community members, victims of police neglect, parents of kids who had stopped calling 911 because they didn't believe help was for them. She sat with them, notebook in hand, and said the same thing she'd written in her own personal journal the night of the incident. I wasn't there to catch them. I was there to see them. That's what changes systems. And that is exactly what she did. Not with punishment alone, but with truth. Layer after layer. Accountability, but also opportunity. Repair. Clarity. The transformation had only just begun. But already the station looked different. The tone was new. Not loud. Not perfect. But intentional. And that was the beginning of something real. Winter gave way to early spring in the city, and with it, something else began to melt. Not the ice on sidewalks or rooftops, but old ways of thinking, of accepting, of excusing. Some changes happen through riots or rulings. Others arrive in silence, sitting in a chair by a vending machine, waiting to be treated like a human being. In the months since Kamira Rhodes walked into that police station and was stripped of respect before her name was ever known, things had moved. Not fast, not in one thunderous overhaul, but methodically, brick by heavy brick, the foundation had shifted. It started with apologies. Real ones this time. Not the media-trained phrases or carefully shaped statements, but handwritten letters from officers, staff members, even civilians who had once rolled their eyes at protesters, now saying, "I saw it, too. I was wrong. I looked away." Kamira never demanded apologies. Her goal was never to break individuals. It was to reveal the systems that protected their behavior. But she understood the power of accountability when it comes willingly. The new front desk now had more than just a bulletproof window and sign-in sheets. It had photographs of all commanders and directors, including Kamira's. Not for show, but so citizens knew who sat at the table when decisions were made, who could be spoken to, who was there for them. The words etched at the bottom of the new mural behind the desk read, "Respect isn't given based on appearance. It is the starting point." Kamira hadn't written it. A community youth group had. Teenagers who had seen the viral video in their classrooms, who had watched someone like them, someone whose skin made her invisible to power at first glance, show that dignity did not have to shout to matter. Training inside the department transformed from compliance-focused to reality-based. Officers now attended sessions where they reviewed not only policies but real video footage. Not just of Kamira's incident, but years of patterns previously ignored. It was difficult, sometimes humiliating, but necessary. They sat through simulations that replicated real civilian experiences. Waiting at the desk for help, reporting minor crimes and being dismissed, asking questions and being brushed off. And as officers played the role of civilians, many struggled. Not because the scenarios were extreme, but because they weren't. They were the ordinary kind of harm. The daily bruises dignity absorbs. Through it all, Kamira led from the background. She didn't take center stage at every press conference. She didn't need her name listed on plaques. But her fingerprints were everywhere. In the protocols, the tone shifts, the choice to listen deeper rather than talk first. One of the most profound changes came 7 months after that first visit. A new civilian oversight committee was formed, not just to respond to complaints, but to co-create policy. Educators, activists, elders, former inmates, young parents, they sat face-to-face with department leads and asked questions that no rank could dodge. Kamira insisted they be paid for their time. "Community work is labor," she told her colleagues. "Paying them isn't charity. It's justice." Beyond department walls, something else stirred. Students in local schools discussed systemic bias not just as some distant term, but something real happening in places their uncles, sisters, and neighbors visited daily. A muralist painted Kamira with her back turned, facing the wall of the very station she had been ignored in. Above her head were dozens of faces. Not famous ones, but citizens from the community, each face representing someone who had once walked into that building and left feeling smaller. There was a quiet ceremony when the mural was unveiled. No reporters, just families. In the back, older women wept. Not because Kamira had been mistreated, but because she had stayed and stayed until she could fix what had hurt so many. Inside the department, some officers left. Some transferred. Others simply couldn't adjust to a culture where their title didn't excuse them from empathy. Kamira didn't celebrate losses, but she also didn't cling to them. Reform is not meant to preserve comfort. It is meant to rebuild trust. At a quarterly city council meeting, Kamira stood at the podium to deliver her first full report. She didn't speak for long. She didn't drone with statistics. She simply said what so many had needed to hear. "We began when someone acted without knowing who I was. And that's exactly when reform must matter most. When no one's watching. When no one important is in the room. When people assume they can do what they've always done. That's when values are tested, and that's when we either pass or repeat. In the audience, there were no cheers, just silence, the kind that follows when everyone hears something they needed, not wanted. Years from now, no one would remember the exact date Kamira walked into that station, but they would remember what happened after. A new recruit, fresh from the academy, would be told during week 1, "Don't judge anyone. Remember the commissioner's lesson. They may not know every detail. They may not know the TikTok clip that first told the world. But the culture would bear her imprint, in small daily moments where respect was given without scanning for status. That had always been Kamira's goal. Not punishment, not revenge, but alignment. A world where dignity sat in every waiting room, where a question asked from behind a shy voice was met with full attention, where uniforms didn't decide who you listened to, and cardigans didn't decide who you ignored. Kamira stood outside the station one late afternoon almost a year later. She watched a young mother approach the desk with her son. The officer smiled and leaned forward to answer her question fully, pointing clearly, showing patience. Kamira didn't go in. She didn't need to. The heart of progress isn't selfies. It's not ceremonies or plaques. It's someone being treated right, and never even knowing how close they came to being dismissed. Just as Kamira once had. She walked away quietly, her work still unfinished, her impact unmistakable. Because when change survives without the hand that started it, that's how you know it's real. If stories like Kamira's moved you, if you've ever seen injustice in silence, and believe power belongs in the hands of the people, then share this story. Someone you know may need to read it. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more real stories that inspire change. Let's build a world where dignity is expected, not earned.